2. The Modern Priestly State, the Sociology of Justification by Law. Culture and society are, as Henry Van Til has pointed out in The Calvinistic Concepts of Culture, simply religion externalized and made explicit. The concept of justification by faith leads inevitably to a radical reconstruction of society in terms of that faith, which has broad implications for all of life. Common to all cultures of antiquity is the priestly character of the state, ruler or central office of the particular society, so that the works of mediation, remission of sins, intercession, and other priestly duties have been central aspects of the life of the body politic. Such a state of things has not been the product of usurpation by the state or merely of confusion, but a healthy recognition of the fundamental nature of law and order. In any healthy society, the courts and all other administrators of law serve to preserve social order and well-being, and any serious breakdown of the integrity, validity, and enforcement of law leads to the progressive collapse of society. Social sin must be atoned for, and the arms of the law function to effect restitution, punishment, and, by removal, the purgation and purification of society. The law in itself is therefore inevitably a manifestation of religion, and, in essence, even in the quote-unquote secular state, religious. The black and clerical robes of modern jurists are an evidence and continuing witness to its medieval claim to priestly status, a claim from which the Church was unable to separate the schools of law. Thus, a functioning society requires a functioning law, effective purgation of the sinner, intercession for the oppressed, and justification for the wrongly oppressed. It is no accident of theology that the language of salvation is juridical language, and salvation a legal transaction, forgiveness itself a legal term, declaring that the charges are dropped, satisfaction having been rendered, or charges deferred for the time being. The language of salvation, of soteriology, is juridical language, because the nature of sin is an offence against the law and covenant of God. Not only is law again involved, but this time fundamental law, law which must be basic to state law. The states, together with all creation, is set in the context of this higher law, however the law be construed. Again, the life of the states is inseparable from this basic environment of higher and absolute law. If social health requires the proper administration of law by the state, then how much more basic is the proper regard for the higher law? If disregard of state law tends to anarchy and chaos, how much more so the disregard of higher law? It is accordingly of fundamental concern to the state and to its continued life. To avoid punishments, with its radical consequences for the state, purgation and priestly intercession are basic to the higher offices of state. Health must be maintained both in terms of internal law and in terms of cosmic law, and hence the state has seen itself as a priestly order called to be the great intermediary between man and the divine, the means and vehicle to the good life and the true society. The consistently relativistic society has never existed. In some societies, the higher law has been seen in supernatural or in theistic and deistic terms, as in the early informative history of the United States. Higher law still prevails where supernaturalism is eroded. Dewey's higher law was democracy, as it is for most Americans today. Philip Mason's election sermon at Boston, May the 27th, 1778, gave evidence of the early rise of an imminent higher law which was to crowd out God. The voice of reason, and the voice of God both teach us that the great object or end of government is the public good. Reason early became an independent power and then a judge over God, and itself the higher law. Social health requires, in all instances, conformity to the higher law, democracy, reason, or God, lest society collapse into anarchy, and this conformity is a priestly function. The Hebrew Commonwealth of the Old Testament stood alone in divorcing priesthood and kingship, but the dominance of the kings over priests was not infrequent. The claim to priesthood by Uzziah only miraculously forestalled, and the syncretistic and apostate rulers openly priestly. The prophetic office was able to protect the integrity of the priest and sanctuary by its radically independent character and to prevent the natural coalescence of the two offices. By virtue of Christ's atonement, his assumption of an eternal and all-sufficient high priesthood, the human office of priest was forever abolished, as Hebrews declared, and priesthood and kingship joined in Christ after the order of Melchizedek. Not only were the implications of Hebrews radical religiously, but politically as well, as Rome quickly discovered in dealing with the Church, which refused to recognize the priestly kingship of the emperors while praying for them as kings and governors. Apart from the atonement, the state remained priestly. Under the atonement, the state became ministerial, or more accurately, a diaconate. Romans 13, 1-7, the word in verse 4 being diakonos. In terms of the kingdom of God, the offices of priest and king are united in the person of Christ. Since the basic unity of the kingdom is supernatural and messianic, the purpose of biblical history was thus to point to the ultimate and transcendental unity while preventing an imminent and man-centered unity. Such an earthly unity of the two offices would transform the realm into the kingdom of man and make it a messianic order. How has the modern state become priestly? To understand this, it will be necessary to examine both the nature and function of law in the state. Although the Reformers, by virtue of their war against the Church of Rome, distrusted the Church while too often lacking a similar distrust of the state, they nevertheless undercut the states by their sociology of justification by faith and their ministerial conception of all authority. Only as the Enlightenment advanced and the Reformation, with some ebb and flow, receded, did the state once again become priestly and itself the order of salvation. Since the modern state is clearly messianic and is, in its own opinion, the vehicle of the good life and the true kingdom, it is clearly priestly. It is, whether democratic or Marxist, the great high priest of the order of salvation, and this is as true of the local politician as of the United Nations. The law is thus the means of salvation, the means to creation of the good and true society. This legalistic principle, against which Romans and all Scripture is directed, is as invalid politically as religiously. In modern thought, the contrast and parallelism with reference to salvation between legalistic thinking and biblical thinking is especially striking. Man, his fourfold estate. 1. The state of original righteousness. Law, its fourfold function. 1. The law as the means of serving God and acknowledging his sovereignty. Man, 2. The state of sin, total depravity. Law, 2. The law as an indictment as a schoolmaster to reveal to man his radical impotence, and as a terror, a means of restraining the total outbreak of sin. Man, 3. The state of grace or regeneration. Law, 3. The law as man's new nature, written on his heart, a guide to his conduct, and a restraint to the motions of sin, the means of sanctification. Man. 4. The state of glory. Law. 4. Law as totally man's new nature in total sanctification, man's true and full freedom in and under law. When we turn to the two forms of natural law common to modern statism, we find a different significance for law. Radically simplified, the two can be distinguished by their treatment of the state of nature. In the one, the state of nature is one of primitive innocence, as Dryden's Indians, guiltless men that danced away their time, fresh as their groves, and happy as their clime. Nature is normative, and the state of nature is that of innocence. In the other view, the state of nature is that out of which man must evolve. The pattern of the first can be briefly summarized as follows. Man. 1. The state of nature, primitive innocence. Law. 1. Law as man's unconscious state, man being guiltless, is in full conformity to nature. Man. 2. The fall of man into unnatural society and civilization. Law. 2. Quote-unquote, unnatural society is violent disregard for the laws of being and of nature. Salvation is by a return to nature. This return is by law. The general will is the unconscious will at times, but always true law for man. Man. 3. Nature began as a primitive unity and culminates in a complex unity. Law. 3. The general will, natural law, rules through either democracy or dictatorship and saves men and society. If need be, men, Rousseau said, are forced to be free. Law in this conception is clearly redemptive, and the state priestly as the mediator of this salvation. Modern democracies and Marxist states are thus avowedly given to a program of salvation by legislation. In the second pattern of natural law, another interpretation emerges. The first offers us scientific socialism, but the second is no less scientific. Man. 1. The state of nature is primeval chaos or being. Law. 1. Law is progress, developments, entelechy, natural selection, or evolution. Man. 2. Nature develops upward. Law. 2. Law develops also, and man's salvation depends on the laws of nature. The discovery of natural law becomes not only a scientific, but status concern as instrumental to power and salvation. Man. 3. Nature began as a primitive unity and culminates in a complex unity. Law. 3. Law works to the unity of all men in terms of that basic continuity of being which is the ground of life. A third and somewhat earlier version of the law of nature appeared in markedly Christian terminology at times, in ostensibly close connection with the doctrine of total depravity, and presented a syncretistic sociology. Stated simply, its basic premises were as follows. Man. 1. Man is a self-centered being. Law. 1. The true law is self-interest. Man. 2. Man seeks self-interest because of self-love. Law. 2. Self-interest is that natural law which leads to man's real happiness and therefore social salvation. Man. 3. Man fulfills his being in nature by self-interest. Law. 3. The free society and true society is created by this natural law of self-interest. This concept was early formulated It appeared in Blackstone's jurisprudence, for example, as a guiding principle. He, the Creator, has been pleased so to contrive the constitution and frame of humanity that we should want no other prompter than to inquire after and pursue the rule of right, but only our own self-love, this universal principle of action. The fundamental error of this position was twofold. First, sin and self-interest cannot be equated, as was so often done, for self-interest is not necessarily sin. Second, man the sinner is rarely capable of genuine self-interest, but is rather destructive, perverse, and perverted, as well as suicidal in his course, as Romans 1 makes clear. The entelechy of sin is to burn, Romans 1:27, or more accurately, to burn out itself rather than to be intelligently capable of self-interest. In any case, in this philosophy as well, law was redemptive, although the states, so strongly governed by a mixture of Christian and non-Christian principles, did not become as openly soteriological and priestly. During the early years of the United States, this philosophy and Christian faith were both influential among other forces. There were more than a few ready to assert redemptive ideas during the American Revolution, and there were many who held that the spirit actuating the colonies, quote, was as much from God as the descent of the Holy Ghost on the day of Pentecost, and was introductory to something great and good to mankind. But the strong elements of the sociology of justification by faith were clearly present in the founding of many of the American colonies, theocratic in nature, and experiments in Christian church, society, and state, although the rebellion against this concept and its development was constant and marked. The tension between the two principles is basic to the history of the colonies and the United States. In Massachusetts, magistrates and ministers began on the premise that the Scriptures were the common law of the land, and when pressed to a formulation of the Body of Liberties in 1641, drawn up by Reverend Nathaniel Ward of Ipswich, stated those statutes in biblical terms as far as possible. The natural law which John Winthrop recognized in his Little Speech on Liberty in 1645 meant that our nature is now corrupt. This natural liberty is common to man with beasts and other creatures. By this, man as he stands in relation to man simply hath liberty to do what he lists. It is a liberty to evil as well as to good. This liberty is incompatible and inconsistent with authority, and cannot endure the least restraints of the most just authority. This is that great enemy of truth and peace, that wild beast, which all the ordinances of God are bent against to restrain and subdue it. Law, therefore, does not convert evil or redeem it, but is only a means of restraint. For Winthrop, civil, federal, or moral liberty has its foundation under law and in reference to the covenant between God and man. This liberty is maintained and exercised in a way of subjection to authority. It is the same kind of liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free. In this faith, Christ is the instrument of salvation and therefore both the principle of liberty and the great high priest. Law becomes then not a work of salvation, but a restraint upon evil, a guide to the godly, and the condition of true liberty. But in the absence of this faith, or in rebellion against it, the modern state has returned to the religion of natural man and of Pharisaism, to salvation by law. The modern state is thus inevitably a priestly state and a soteriological state dedicated to the radically anti-Christian religion of works salvation, salvation by law. The proliferation of legislation is impelled by this messianic urge, and every political campaign presents its program as a kind of true second advent. only the right combination of laws is needed to create the good, true, and saving society. But law, on any other foundation than God's terms and His law, becomes anti-law, destructive of law, order, and society. This is exactly what such legislation has become, as witness the National Labour Relations Board and its administrative law. An excellent study of the breakdown of law, the rise of favouritism and violence, and the substitution of kangaroo courts for courts of law is Sylvester Petro's The Kohler Strike, Union Violence and Administrative Law. The state becomes for capital, labour, agriculture, education, for every man and institution, the saving power by means of law and the unlimited source of all bounty and blessing. The state has become the priestly mediator of the good life, at whose hands all citizens, schools, institutions, and causes must seek salvation and preservation. The great high priest after the ancient order of Babel. The lines of division are, doctrinally, as sharply drawn as in the days of Rome and of emperor worship, which involved essentially the recognition of the soteriological and priestly role of the state as the divine human messianic order. The lines of division, humanly and ecclesiastically, are unfortunately scarcely drawn as yet. But men cannot seek justification socially by law and works of law, and long retain a conception of individual salvation through justification by faith. The presence of the former is due to the erosion of the latter. Men who have Christ as their all-sufficient priest cannot create or tolerate a priestly and soteriological state.